now, along the lines of a major or minor conceit, great pleasure to introduce one of the rising stars. It's nice to get people, particularly friends, embarrassed. Uday, Uday Chandra. Uday received his BA in economics from Grinnell College, which is in Iowa, when he also spent a year at the LSE as an exchange student. And he acquired plenty of the empiricist idiom in LSE, but mercifully he didn't acquire a horrible Brit accent. He went on to then do an MA in political science from Yale University, an MPhil in political science from Yale University, and finally received his PhD in political science from Yale University last year. He is currently a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, a fellowship which sort of goes on and on. I mean, there is a termination point, but he's young, and, it's many years from now. Uday is actually... I didn't try that because, between the two of them, they slaughter me because I can't get that Göttingen properly. Okay, so Uday has published very, very widely. He has articles coming out in Journal of Contemporary Asia, Modern Asian Studies. He has a forthcoming book called The Autobiography of an Unknown Tribal, Tumba Prachar and His Tryst with Modernity. This is not the book which is based on his PhD dissertation. He has several edited journal issues which are forthcoming, and you can talk to him afterwards or during the discussion about this. So I'm not going to say much more about his publications, but well, actually, I should say that how we met was actually on that nefarious sort of social networking thing called Facebook. And then we started getting along, and then we fought. But I read an article of his which I asked him to send me, which I was very impressed by. And it is, can you find it for me? Okay, so it's in the Law and Society Review, and it's called Liberalism and Its Other, The Politics of Primitivism in Colonial and Post-Colonial Indian Law. And Uday would clarify this, but that isn't, but Uday, this article is like a critical take on the forms of primitivist politics in colonial law, basically. And I think what he's going to present today came out as a kind of a twin thing of this article. Because Uday, who's a bit of a Facebook warrior, or he was a Facebook warrior, decided that he had to take on the radicals as much as the colonialists. So he decided to write the present article, and he'd clarify this. So I don't think the people we're waiting for are coming. I've tried my best to faff along in cover time. I think we should start now. So from Bihar, India, via Yale, United States, and now Max Planck, Germany, Uday Chandra.
Thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great pleasure to be among all of you with very diverse interests in regional and disciplinary specializations. It is, and I'm very happy that to be in Mexico City and visiting Saurabh Nishita. I don't know how many of you got the circulated paper and were able to glance at it, but I will assume that not many did, and or even if you did, you didn't really look through it very much or very carefully due to time constraints. What I'm going to talk today is about what Saurabh talked about primitivism, and I'll just define it in a minute, and what it means for writing histories of populations or groups that are seen as tribal, primitive, wild in an earlier imaginary, the challenges that arise both for colonial and post-colonial writers who are writing from the point of view of the state and the administration, as well as for those who are historians, critical historians, sometimes even radical historians in a self-avowed way, who want to be speaking for and representing subaltern voices or indigenous voices, and as part of a wider genre of post-colonial history writing and post-colonial studies. So what I'm going to talk about here is, well, start out by first defining what I mean by primitivism. And for me, it's a very precise thing. It's a colonial ideology of rule that sought to manage populations in places described as wild, savage, or simply primitive. Now, there were other such colonial ideologies of rule which we are familiar, the ideas of Muslim fanaticism, the ideas of Oriental despotism, which served to both justify colonial rule, as well as, these also operated as a kind of social theory or an explanation for the kinds of societies that were meant to be governed within multi-ethnic empires. So primitivism too was a justification for a particular kind of legal administrative system in a colonized territory, and a social theory meant to understand the inner structure of a colonized society. But yet, one of the things which I've argued in that paper in the Law and Society Review, that primitivism was a distinctly liberal ideology of rule. According to John Stuart Mill's ladder of civilizational maturity in the mid-19th century, childlike savages, what he called savages, ranked below agrarian society, or in his vocabulary, slaves, pastoralists or barbarians, and commercial society or civilization, a kind of four-tier hierarchy. But post-1858, when India officially became part of the British Empire under Queen Victoria, it was the East India Company that was the governing body, both merchant and state rolled into one. Post-1858, with the formal takeover, scholars have now argued, especially Karuna Mantena, has recently argued that agrarian societies in the Millian framework came to be seen as the domain of non-liberal, even illiberal, customary arrangements by administrators such as Henry Sumner Maine, who was a key figure in the post-1858 transformation of society and law. But votaries of primitivism in Victorian India in the late 19th century saw tribal populations as childlike and backward in exactly John Stuart Mill's sense, as you'll find in On Liberty. And his argument, therefore, is for both protection and improvement at the same time. So it's an exception to liberal norms and legal traditions, but very much within the defined liberal domain. Now, patrons of primitive societies, W.W. Hunter, Edward Dalton, in the places that in Eastern India where I've worked, were essentially interested in discovering the non-Aryan or pre-Aryan essence in the wilds of the subcontinent, intending to protect this primitivist essence and raise educational and economic standards in these tribal zones simultaneously. So again, protection and improvement going together, though they are obviously contradictory impulses that people were trying to reconcile. So primitivism then was a justificatory argument to govern these primitive places or wild places, and also an anthropological theory that explained the workings of the most backward human societies. So it was an anthropological affair too. Now, the anthropological works that advanced the ends of colonial primitivism oscillated between scientific pretensions modeled along the lines of evolutionary biology and geology, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a neo-romantic yearning for alternative social possibilities that defied the corruption and moral turpitude that was seen to be very much part of modern civilization in the late 19th century. Now, plenty has been written in the South Asian circles about the efforts by anthropometrists to measure people's noses and craniums and so on in various parts of, well, not just India, but globally. And also pseudo-scientific endeavors to treat tribes as analogous to the lower strata of the Earth's crust, so a kind of geological analogy. But relatively little ink, I think, has been spilled in comparison on understanding the neo-romantic impulses that propelled colonial anthropology in Victorian India. Now, these impulses arose alongside the import of Germanic ideas of the folk into British India. The Roman historian Tacitus was a key figure here, as Ananya Kabir has recently shown, insofar as Tacitus's Germania became a model in both Germany and India for imagining tribes as animists and foragers who owned land communally and worshipped in sacred groves deep in the woods. This Tacitian model of primitive society and religion was reified through accounts of heroism in defense of Teutonic freedom rooted in nature and community. Like their German nationalist counterparts, British anthropologists and administrators, in Kabir's words, used Tacitus to explicate aspects of India, using an analogy between pre-Roman or non-Roman Europe, Germania, and pre- or non-Aryan India. For Colonel Edward Dalton, a key figure in the tribal administration of colonial Bengal, the Indian subcontinent was dotted by pre-modern vestiges and tribal habitats that had, in his words, to a comparatively recent period been regarded by Hindus as outside the pale of Hindustan, occupied by a people who differed from them in religion, in customs, appearances, and languages. These subcontinental tribes, claimed Dalton, had prior to the Aryan occupation of the Gangetic provinces been the dominant races, and hence, in his words, they were living illustrations of the progress of mankind, almost from the Stone Age to the confines of modern civilization. So, whereas the kind of status quoism inspired by Henry Maine for caste society in the plains, as that took shape in post-1858 India, votaries of colonial primitivism such as Dalton delighted in transposing the neo-romantic celebration of nature and freedom from the German past to the imperial present in the non-areas defined outside of caste society. For the neo-romantics who held significant administrative posts in what came to be known as the scheduled districts, which are essentially the tribal zones outside of plains-based caste society in British India, and they saw knowledge of the tribes and their free, nature-loving ways of life as a radical intellectual endeavor that sought to break free from the dullness and discipline of modern Western society. They yearned for what a recent anthropologist has termed Arcadian spaces with visions of alternative moralities. These yearnings rested on neither, and this is a quotation, on neither logical nor empirical science, falling beyond the scope of deductive and inductive reason, that is, neither rational nor irrational, but non-rational. This non-rational approach to scholarly writing and argumentation, then and now, because I think we all recognize it very much in our own times as well, makes it possible to project one's own radical political aspirations onto those who cannot speak but must be spoken for. The two most likely candidates in this category were tribes, understood as wild humans, and wild non-human animals, both of which attracted copious flows of neo-romantic reflection in British India. From the very beginning, Indians of high social rank found primitivism to be an attractive ideology for their own ends. On the one hand, Indians under colonial rule were only too happy to appropriate the apocryphal narrative of the Aryan conquest of the subcontinent to highlight their close racial and civilizational proximity to the white colonizers, and their corresponding distance from tribal or aboriginal groups. As Shumit Guha has persuasively argued, the mythic history of clashing races proved very useful indeed when brown sahibs and white sahibs sought to escape their fears about the instability of social hierarchy by giving it a biological basis and projecting it onto the past, thus covering extant hierarchies with the mantle of the natural and the primordial. That's Shumit Guha. Now, on the other hand, what we find is the neo-romantic essence of primitivism, also appealing very greatly to upper caste Indian writers, insofar as it dovetailed nicely with the quest among the colonized to bypass distressing details of the recent past, to construct alternative pasts in which there were neither British nor Muslim rulers. Much like the so-called dream histories of writers such as Bhudev Mukhopadhyay, anthropological reflections on tribal India promise to take readers beyond what they may have understood as the prison of reality, or what Dipesh Chakrabarty calls Victorian fetishes of discipline, routine, and order. Such attitudes towards the past, reason, and tribes, both then and now, have curiously come to be regarded as radical in Indian intellectual circles. It's against this backdrop of Indian radicalism and the inability of mainstream nationalism to absorb it fully that we must interpret Ranjit Guha's lament, the founder of Subaltern Studies School, about the failure of the Indian bourgeoisie to speak for the nation, and of the scholarly failure to acknowledge the contributions made by the people on their own, that is, this is his words, independently of the elite, to the making and development of this nationalism. Now, this critique of mainstream nationalism led by the Congress Party contains within itself what the historian Ben Zachariah has called a residual nationalism, which directed scholars to look for the truly national in the subaltern, as against the merely bourgeois national that existed among the elite. In other words, Ranjit Guha sought to posit a more authentic nationalism in the realm of subaltern politics, which not only negated the Congress mainstream's claims to moral and political leadership of the nation, but also defended Indian nationalism from revisionists in the so-called Cambridge School, who understood nationalism in India as merely hollow. It's unlikely that a better candidate could exist for such a high purpose than the tribal of colonial yore. So the subalternist's rediscovery of the primitive tribe must be understood in these terms rather than on the basis of any deep prior engagement with the vast anthropological corpus on India or other ex-colonial territories, let alone any personal contact with the tribes themselves. Dipesh Chakrabarty makes the point abundantly clear when he writes that unlike E.P. Thompson and others in the UK, who were interested in recovering the mentalities and experiences of actually existing peasants or workers, Ranjit Guha was interested only in making a theoretical argument about subaltern consciousness, as it revealed itself in particular practices of resistance and rebellion. According to Chakrabarty, the word elementary in Guha's title, in elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India, the word elementary acknowledges the structuralist tradition to which Guha affiliates his book. But such an explanation can't tell us why the elementary in elementary aspects should be equated with the primitive. The only possibility here is that the primitive rebel is for Guha the authentic Indian subaltern nationalist. It's also no accident that the title of Guha's book recalls Emil Durkheim's The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Durkheim wished to identify the most primitive religion in the world in order to lay bare the religious nature of man, an essential and permanent aspect of humanity. If Durkheim relied on models of primitive society to articulate a theory of religion, Guha relied on representations of primitive rebels to articulate a theory of anti-colonial consciousness. In both cases, the evolutionary assumptions of colonial anthropology seeped, however unwittingly, into celebrated works of social theory. For Ranjit Guha, if the primitive rebel stood as the nationalist, or at least the anti-colonial subaltern figure par excellence, then it was necessary to take this figure into intellectual battle. The sparring partner here was neither the Cambridge nor nationalist historians of the day, but the British Marxist Eric Hobsbawm, who had in 1959 written a panoramic overview of primitive rebels in Europe. For Hobsbawm, although the activism of ordinary rural men and women always departed from the right kind of ideas about political organization, strategy and tactics, and the right kind of program, their blinding and groping ways were without the guidance of a revolutionary party. And which was nonetheless important in the success of social revolutions, such as those in Russia, Cuba, and China. Guha, in fact, came to more or less the same conclusion about the politics of primitive rebels in the Indian nationalist movement. He wrote, "More often than not, it lacked neither in leadership nor in aim, nor even in some rudiments of a program, although none of these attributes could compare in maturity or sophistication with those of the historically more advanced movements of the 20th century. The evidence is ample and unambiguous on this point. Quite clearly, one is dealing with a phenomenon that was nothing like a modern party leadership." He added, "It would be wrong, of course, to overestimate the maturity of this politics and read into it the qualities of a subsequent phase of more intensified class conflict, widespread anti-imperialist struggle, and generally a high level of militancy among the masses. Compared to these, the peasant movements of the first 3/4 of British rule represented a somewhat inchoate and naive state of consciousness." Yet for Guha's primitive rebel to be recognized in its own terms, it was necessary for it to slay the white man. Armed with the kind of bravado that, I think usually accompanies folly, Guha castigated Hobsbawm for his use of the term pre-political to describe primitive rebels, when in fact his own assessment of the inchoate and naive consciousness, as well as their not yet mature politics, was frankly harsher. The disagreement here is purely semantic. Both Hobsbawm and Guha recognize the political salience of primitive rebels, even as they recognize the limits to their politics. But whereas Hobsbawm used pre-political to denote forms of politics that predate modern constitutional or party-driven politics, Guha makes the same evolutionist point within his expanded notion of the political. Yet Guha and later Chakrabarti portrayed it as a kind of apocalyptic intellectual clash between Europe and the ex-colonial world. Guha suggests that Hobsbawm's material is of course derived almost entirely from the European experience, and his generalizations are perhaps in accord with it. And hence, whatever its validity for other countries, the notion of pre-political peasant insurgency helps little in understanding the experience of colonial India. At stake here lay the ability of the radical Indian historian to represent the historical realities of colonial India. Real existing subalterns, including primitive rebels, were incidental to this epistemic combat between putative representatives of a hyper-real Europe and post-colonial intellectuals in India. Less generously, one may say that the whole affair was a veritable storm in a teacup by partisans of a residual nationalism who were anxious to provincialize Europe and assert their own authentic Indianness simultaneously. However noble its aims and ideals, it was far from clear whether a project so oblivious to its own blind spots and anxieties could yield a suitable model for coming to terms with the primitive subject of modern Indian history. Once the loud cheers of self-congratulation and chest-thumping had ended, the more mundane tasks of reading dusty government files, extracting inferences from them, and representing the rediscovered primitive remained. In the rest of this paper, I'm going to I'm going to critically analyze these mundane matters of historical method and interpretation in Ranajit Guha's famous reading of the Santal Hool of 1855. Now, my aim is not so much to analyze the discursive elements of Guha's prose as to offer a critical reconstruction of the Santal Hul in critical conversation with Guha's version. The audience must evaluate both interpretations of the same set of events from the same files, noting the overlaps and divergences that follow. Now, it's well known that the major cause of the armed uprising of Santals, a tribal group in eastern India in 1855, lay in their long-standing concerns over Bengali mercantile groups or Mahajans in the area. Accordingly, the young rebel leaders, Sidhu and Kanu Majhi, both descended from a Santal headman's lineage, wrote to the district magistrate, "The Mahajans have committed heinous crimes." The word they used, the local word was pap, "and all have acted unjustly." These complaints followed directly from initiatives taken by military proconsuls, army men in the area, after earlier insurrections to encourage Mahajans to settle in this tribal zone and to expand commercial networks there, along the lines of the do commerce thesis, which essentially understood commerce as a way of bringing civilization to what was seen as backward areas. The expansion of new commercial networks, replacing older ones, unsurprisingly ran into trouble from those among the Santal village leadership who took loans at high rates of interest from these money-lending Mahajans. Sidhu and Kanu, who were, according to the colonial archive, very much in debt and never paid their creditors, demanded that their creditors should not be paid and that in future only 1 paise per rupee, so that's about 1%, per annum should be the interest. In his testimony to the judicial officer in charge, Sidhu added, "My quarrel with the Mahajans is that they charge 5 rupees interest for 1 rupee lent. They also require more than 2 solis," I suppose that means this refers to bags, "of rice, and if we don't give it, they pull our ears and beat us." Sidhu claimed that this was not only unjust but humiliating, and he had conveyed the same in person and through petitions to Mr. Pontet, the deputy collector of the district, albeit without any response. This is what he said to the officer later. "I have often complained this to Pontet, but he never listened. I gave him petitions at Burishnar Nagar, Barhet, and Gachari, but he would not listen. I also petitioned him at Rajmahal. He only said, 'You have eaten first from the Mahajans, Banchut Sala. Now you have come to complain, Sala Banchut,'" which literally means bloody sister fucker. Finally, Sidhu decided to approach the police constable or daroga in charge, Mohesh Dutt, for aid in countering the Mahajans. He said, "I have been complaining for 5 years against the Mahajans, and up till now, no investigations have been made." On hearing this, he continued, "Mohesh Dutt abused me. Then I killed Mohesh Dutt with a sword with my own hand." Contrary to Guha's ideas about subalterns negating colonial power via sporadic acts of violence, notions of honor were central to Sidhu's explanation for his actions. It angered him that a young man from a distinguished Santal family could be held hostage to the whims of lowly banyas or merchants charging extortionate rates of interest. It angered him further that despite a strong case against the Mahajans, he had been humiliated in public repeatedly by the magistrate as well as a police constable. Taking the law into his own hands followed from these circumstances. Sidhu was not alone. His brothers and the Majhis, village headmen, among the Santals, stood in solidarity with him. The Majhis, this is what the colonial archive says, "The Majhis bound the daroga, and then I killed him." That was what his testimony was. Besides the Mahajans, the Sahibs, the colonial officialdom, and their misdeeds, also figure prominently. Besides the Mahajans, the Sahibs and their misdeeds also feature quite prominently in Sidhu's testimony. Not only did Mr. Pontet, in this narrative, fail to register Sidhu's complaints, he also raised the annual rents on land from 5 to 9 rupees. But Sidhu says, the land is just the same as when I paid 5 rupees. First, he said, Pontet gave much dik or trouble. He added, only 1 anna should be paid for each oxen plough and 2 annas for a buffalo plough. The police constables and junior officers, Sidhu claimed, further extorted anywhere between 5 and 10 rupees from each village. The amlas, or judicial officers, he and his brother Kanu wrote in their parwana or proclamation to the colonial state, the amlas now made the whole rules and regulations bad, and this is sin to the sahibs. Now, this is a surprising reference I found to the rules and regulations of Bengal as an object of veneration, which is absolutely critical to understand here the nature of colonial subject formation. By no means did Sidhu or Kanu seek to disparage or oppose colonial governmentality as a whole. This is entirely Ranajit Guha's imaginative insertion into historical proceedings. It's telling, in fact, that the Thakur, or deity, that allegedly appeared before the 2 brothers was perceived as a white man with a dhuti or chadar, which is a traditional garb of an upper caste gentleman, and who sat on the ground, however, as a sahib. The Thakur, or deity, apparently told the brothers in arms, tell the sahib to cut your claims. You must not run away. Tell the sahib to let the majhis, or the Santal headmen, go. His brother Kanu actually told all the Santals that they were to pay all the revenue to the government and to place themselves under the charge of him and his brother Sidhu. The Santals were expected to remain loyal to the Raj, but simply to treat Sidhu and Kanu, the brothers, both majhis or village headmen, as local state authorities in place of the existing set of officials, including one of whom had been murdered. Guha was certainly aware of this current in rebel consciousness, but his prior commitment to an anti-colonial position obviously blinded him to the ways in which Sidhu and Kanu may have actually seen themselves as loyal colonial subjects, denied justice by mischievous individual officers. Now, a final word must be reserved for the religious dimension of the insurgency, which is emphasized quite emphatically and enthusiastically by Ranajit Guha, as well as the colonial officer in this case, J.R. Ward, who was a military officer on special duty after the Hool. And Ward wrote to his superior in Calcutta, the colonial capital, he said, I have been unable to trace the insurrection to anything but fanaticism. Expressing bewilderment as much as disgust, Ward continued, an almighty and inspired being had appeared as the redeemer of their caste, and their ignorance and superstition was easily worked into a religious frenzy which has stopped at nothing. Whereas Ward believed that martial law alone appeared sufficient in this particular instance to suppress the insurgency, Ranajit Guha's inversive reading strategies lead him to exaggerate and valorize the Santal rebels' religious motivations to rebel. Writing of the Thakur, the new deity who is believed to have inspired Sidhu and Kanu to rebel, Ranajit Guha explains, in what was clearly a case of overdetermination, the power of the colonialist Sahib and that of the pen-pushing, dhoti-clad Babu were telescoped here in a composite vision and telescoped to divine power. Now here we find the omniscient post-colonial historian seeking to rationally explain away the motives of primitive rebels in a non-rational idiom and then regard it as a radical exercise. Now this kind of inversive reading of the colonial archive, ironically, reinforces old colonial stereotypes of excitable primitive minds not amenable to reason. That is, of course, not to say that religion was irrelevant to the leaders and participants in the Santal Hool. But the new religion was crafted carefully from disparate old and new elements by the brothers in arms Sidhu and Kanu to legitimize their political authority. When the police officer, Mr. Toogood, entered the rebels' home in the village of Bhanganadi, he found a Thakur Badi, literally a house or temple built for the deity, in the middle of Kanu's compound, a fairly large compound. Under a large cover made of wicker work, the Thakur deity consisted of a circle of mud about 2 feet in diameter, raised some 2 inches, but connected with the adjacent earth, and having in the center another small circle about 3 inches in diameter, and similarly raised about 2 inches in fact. The Thakur was exactly like one of the solid wooden cartwheels used by these hill people. Now, it's incorrect to say that the Thakur was imagined by his devotees as a wooden cart, especially since Sidhu and Kanu clearly describe what the deity looked like. Most likely, the wicker-covered cart was built as a kind of resting place for the Thakur when he did in fact descend from heaven to earth. We also learned from Toogood's report that when milk was poured on it, from its fissures it sprouted up, and other phenomena were seen. Such phenomena were taken to be signs of the deity's presence. Indeed, Sidhu and Kanu had told the Majhis, or headmen of nearby villages, to bring cups of milk as offerings to the Thakur. And when the lay villagers asked in what form the Thakur had appeared, Sidhu and Kanu said, in a flame of fire. When the milk used to rise up, it was presented by the brothers as a proof of the Thakur's presence. Sometimes when a man was doubted, his cup of milk was declared to be of a bluish color, and he was then pronounced to be untrue to Thakur, and the offering was refused. The Thakur's cart was also surrounded by the heads of goats and 2 buffaloes, which animals were early that morning offered as an oblation to the deity, after which Kanu led forth the men to attack. This kind of blood sacrifice is hardly uncommon in eastern India and is pretty straightforwardly tantric Shaktic in origin. And I can talk more about that later. But this is by no means traditional Santal religion as Guha and others have assumed. What we find instead is evidence of a new kind of communitas carefully conjured up in a ritual idiom, even as it served an overtly political purpose. The distinction between the inner and outer worlds of this inchoate community in the making was, to say the least, blurry. It's noteworthy that the Santal rebels sought inspiration in a set of existing Tantric Shaktic ritual practices in eastern India, and it's equally noteworthy that they also drew on the new symbols and ideas introduced by Christian missionaries in the region. In the sanctum sanctorum of the Thakur's resting place, wrapped up in a white cloth and tied round with a piece of gold string, were 4 books which it is reported fell from heaven. These books were believed to contain the orders of the Thakur, and hence they were read every day at the Thakur Badi. If the modern reader is skeptical of the influence of Christianity on the new rebel religion, then this skepticism must be laid to rest by the fact that the 4 books were translations of the Gospel of St. John into Bengali and other languages. Lest there are any lingering doubts, consider the Santal rebels' recorded statement that they took up arms at the order of a god who they incarnated in the person of a child and who they carry with them, and that this child is to reign as God and king. The amalgam of the old and new, the homegrown and the foreign, is striking here. Yet readers of elementary aspects know nothing of this. The evidence presented so far cannot be neatly fit in to a narrow politics of negation motivated by anti-colonial sentiment. We are better served by acknowledging the modernity of tradition underlying the creativity of the Santal rebels, who sought to construct a new moral political community bound by the new religion and oriented towards negotiating the colonial state from below. Amalgam of disparate elements found in Sidhu Kanu's religion is apparent. It bore the imprint of the colonial army and Christian missionary activity in the region, but it was also a creative response of newly minted tribal subjects who sought to present themselves as different from Hindus and Muslims in the subcontinent. Eventually, paternalistic administrators and census enumerators came up with a term to describe such ritual and religious practices, animism. And that's how the census recorded them from the start. Yet far from being a continuation of tradition, the new politics of difference practiced by the Santals had everything to do with their own hybrid forms of modernity. What we glimpse in these extracts from colonial files is a long and complex process by which certain groups became tribes in modern India. The making of the modern tribal subject is a process that I think needs to be understood in dialogue with historical processes of modern state making in the so-called scheduled districts, or scheduled areas as they are called now. These intertwined processes of state making and subject making render the notion of tribe to be a pure state effect rather than the natural category it is typically understood to be. As we have seen already, the modern tribal subject in the making could negotiate the secular trappings of governmental power as well as the political theological realm of society. And she could do so peacefully as well as violently, through petitions as well as through overt acts of violence, demonstrating dramatically the real limits of paternalistic colonial power and the primitivist ideology that animated it. Yet, in Ranajit Guha's words, and he's citing Levi-Strauss here, as kind of talking about a stereotype, these were illiterate people living in conditions of a Stone Age culture in the jungle, and hence were anti-colonial figures par excellence. Now, how do we explain this mistaken view of the Santal Hool, and more generally, the inability of the radical post-colonial historian to apprehend the rebels' motivations? Ironically, the answer, I think, lies in a colonial proclamation that reworks primitivism after its spectacular failure to anticipate or explain the Hool. In the following words, the proclamation reasserts primitivism as a colonial ideology, sounding much like sounding very much and somewhat eerily like the modern-day champion of the tribal subject. Says the system of administration in the old Bengal districts was totally unsuited to the character and habits of such people as the Paharis or the Santals. And the rude Santals were sure to be involved in 1,000 mazes, difficulties, and perplexities, and at last to be invariably worsted by their astute and experienced adversaries. Now, the sympathy of the radical historian today, who assumes a simple binary opposition between primitive subject and modern state, follows directly from the sympathy of colonial official pronouncements after the Hool. The statements of Sidhu and Kanu either fall by the wayside or appear in snippets to articulate a new kind of primitivism that celebrates the tribal as an exemplary anti-colonial icon. Even when the subaltern speaks to us down the ages, however incoherently and incompletely, the radical subalternist chooses to encode her speech into a primitivist frame of reference. To sum up, what we find in elementary aspects is a well-intentioned intellectual effort to represent subaltern actors as anti-colonial rebels. Yet this effort is hampered by its tendency to take colonial discourses on tribes at their face value. Their primitive and separate ways of life, their excitable minds, and fanatical adherence to their traditional religion, their ignorance of modern state practices that constituted colonial governmentality, and their zealous defense of not just their freedom, but freedom with a capital F. In Partha Chatterjee's words, built into subaltern studies focus on peasant insurgency was the assumption that the state and forms of governance were external to the immediate social world of peasants. This was understood to be a radical move. Yet, Guha's attempt to find the elementary aspects of anti-colonial insurgency in tribal rebellions appear considerably less radical politically and intellectually than it pretends to be. As he put it in the course of delineating the nature of tribal consciousness, to overestimate its lucidity or depth will be ill-advised, for it is still a rather hesitant, inchoate, and disjointed perception. In other words, only the radical post-colonial historian truly knows and can speak legitimately of his subalterns. Such an attitude to history writing ironically reinforces the colonial ideology of primitivism, albeit with the radical Indian historian of India now assuming the role of the paternalistic colonial administrator in his solar topi. Shorn of the will to improve, colonial-style primitivism is left merely with the conservative will to protect and preserve tribes based on the belief that they are vestiges of a bygone era and are long-lost selves. Yet the received wisdom and commonplace of colonial officials has now come to be mistaken by some as interpretive novelty. If we are to escape the primitivist trap of writing tribal histories or primitive histories, to illustrate elementary aspects of some phenomenon of interest, then we must start taking seriously the available historical evidence on so-called tribes and recognizing how the making of the modern tribal subject is intertwined inextricably with modern state formation in India and beyond. We must abandon the conceit of an earlier historiography that imagined the state and forms of governance were external to the immediate social world of peasants, including tribal subjects. And when we say that the tribe is a modern state effect in Timothy Mitchell's sense, we mean that tribe and state constitute each other in areas that are deemed to be the margins of modern empires and nation-states. It's necessary, therefore, to appreciate the entanglement of power and resistance, in the words of Gyan Prakash, and to give up on the scholarly romance of resistance. The interests of social theory, I think, will be better served by more rather than less careful attention to the life worlds of so-called primitive or tribal subjects, whether past or present. Anthropological engagements with so-called primitive subjects will also be better served by banishing the savage slot and our own neo-romantic longings. For those who will still persist in seeking Arcadian spaces as political utopias in the forests and hills, it may well be worth recalling that the word utopia literally means a non-place or no place at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Uday. I'm sure there are loads of questions, but in my sort of capacity as chair, let me just raise certain wider issues and questions which might help point the discussion in certain ways. And let me confess that I ask these questions not as a neo-romantic, but as an endless romantic, who also reasons, but reasons in contending hermeneutic ways. There are more forms of reasoning than one. So my first sort of point is, what are the different registers of primitivism? Is primitivism simply a colonial liberal ideology? Or is not primitivism also an aesthetic practice, extending from Picasso to Ramkinkar Bej to after? And does not that form of primitivism as an aesthetic practice actually embody certain, a certain kind of a critique of both the imperial and the bourgeois world order, one in which we continue to live? Related to this is, I think you need to take on board, more than just the ideology. I think you need to look at, in terms of the registers of primitivism, the overwhelming sexuality, the homoeroticism which accompanies the idea of the primitive. And there's a link here of the administrators with having gone to British public schools, and there's, you might look at Scaria's Shades of Wildness, but there's much more there, not just in South Asia, but in Africa and Indonesia and so on. And so also I'd like to ask you, just by invoking this word primitive, what is accomplished? Because Durkheim's primitive is very different from the sort of primitive which was invoked by colonial ethnology. Now, this Uday gets me to the fact that, in part I'm in dialogue with different writings of yours, not all of which have been read here. But I think your twin critique of the colonial liberal and then of the subaltern plays into certain enduring expectations in academia. And I'm going to be very blunt as you prepare this essay for American Historical Review. You know, what are the requirements of critique and reading in the academy? You know, I think there's a constant incitement to critique, okay? To an, you know, a virtually irresponsible critique, you know, a no-holds-barred one, particularly, you know, if it can be an act of patricide or fratricide. Patricide is better than fratricide because then you're attacking the big figure, right? So, you know, what are the terms? You know, how is one published, including in American Historical Review or American Ethnologist? How is one published? What are the routes to fame and fortune? Critique. You know, reasonable critique or reasonable sounding critique is the best way. As I said, you know. So one of the things is I would turn to the cadences of your own writing here, okay? So what are the registers of your writing? You know, your writing on which the article works. It begins very reasonably, very, very reasonably, laying out the wider issues. Then it goes into a polemical, nicely done, no-holds-barred attack. Then it finds, you know, it comes up with empirical exceptions and a rich narrative about, you know, about the Santals against tendentious theory. And then it comes up with a conclusion which brings it all together. Now, as Talal Asad had once said about Clifford Geertz on religion as a cultural system, he'd written, how reasonable all this sounds, and yet how wrong-headed it is. So about the wrong-headedness. It seems to me that, you know, does Guha use the word primitive rebel at all? You know, does Guha use the category of the primitive? I don't think he does. But that's not the only thing. What Guha does is he brings together the Adivasi, the tribal, as the peasant, not as the primitive rebel. And it seems to me this move of bringing together Ranjit Guha's inclusion of the Adivasi, the tribal, as a peasant, does, you know, it at once upholds and undercuts tropes of primitivism. It upholds them, but it also undercuts them. You know, by making the tribal the present, Guha's struggle was against the administrator and the anthropologist, you know, denying coevalness, in Fabian's terms, to the Santal subject, right? Which gets me to, I'm going to be quick now. Now, I'm not sure, actually. This is not a no-holds-barred defense of Ranjit Guha. Ranjit Guha can be terribly wrong-headed, very ill-tempered. But my question now is, if your readings of Guha do not replicate Guha himself, you know, you can be as ill-tempered in spirit as Guha is, you know, as disaffected at times. And, you know, your reading of the Subaltern Studies project, how it unfolded as a project, you know, is as dismissive and ready as the way in which Guha criticizes the Cambridge School or the nationalists. So, you know, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And finally, can the savage slot be banished? I mean, I think Michel Rawls, through yours point, is precisely that we need to attend to the savage slot, to which I would add the native niche, you know, as upholding the anthropological discipline. And not just the anthropological discipline, but as upholding, as it were, the way in which we approach the world in terms of the traditional and the modern, including the Rudolphs, by the way, the primitive and the civilized, you know, and so on and so forth. So the savage slot cannot be banished, and so also residual nationalism. Our problem is not just residual nationalism. Our bloody problem is nationalism itself. So with that, you know, questions.
I have several, but I'll wait for the others.
Yeah.
Some of us are extremely here, some of us are not.
And the other thing, sí pueden hablar en español, porque hay varios entre nosotros que pueden traducir, ¿no? Si piensan que van a
Then just
formular mejor,
the best
pues sí,
you can express yourself.
exactly, yeah.
I introduced him.
Yeah.
So Ishita,
Eduardo, parece que sí tienes.
Yes, but I would like to wait after.
After your
Mitsan?
No, I think that
you know, we're not about hierarchies.
No, I really would like to wait.
Okay. Más preguntas, comentarios,
Ishita, just
observaciones?
go ahead and people
Yeah?
will come in gradually.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay. I think now that you're going to write it up for American Historical Review,
Yeah.
I think, yes, I'll be a little more critical than what I would have
Yeah.
liked to be, because you're our guest. I'm not sure your reading of Ranajit Guha is deliberately misconceived or is unconscious. Because you can most certainly criticize Guha for generalizations, right?
Yeah.
Because he takes on a century prior to the revolt just to show the consciousness of the rebel consciousness, which is not primitive, by the way, to begin with. The Santal Hul there is just one of these innumerable examples that he takes. So then to focus on one of the hundreds of examples that he cites and then criticize him for the lack of empirical detail, I think it's misplaced. I think it's misplaced because his point is precisely discursive theory to overturn this distinction of the primitive versus the modern. As sort of indicated, his ideal rebel is the peasant, right? And his quarrels with the history from below is precisely that in India it is the peasant and not the proletariat that is the ideal representative of the subaltern. The other thing is this quarrel with the pre-political or Eric Hobsbawm is much more Dipesh Chakraborty clarifying than Ranajit Guha saying it. He says very clearly in the introduction to Subaltern Studies reader that their quarrels were with the Cambridge School and with nationalist historiography. So you cannot, take on what Dipesh Chakraborty writes subsequently to criticize Ranajit Guha, going into, because his most important point is that the ideal peasant is conscious and political, and his generalization, he's probably aware of the generalization, probably not, but his point precisely is that in order to show that the peasant act of insurgency was a conscious political act.
And if I may just add.
Yeah.
So, I remember with an enormous sense of excitement in the early 80s as a BA student, just out of my BA, the sense of excitement with which one read the expansion of the notion of the political. And what was going on there? This was a fight, not with Hobsbawm. This was a fight actually with the CPM.
Yeah.
Because it was Naxalite politics. It's politics about, about a certain kind of a left which does not want CPM kind of, Communist Party of India, Marxist kind of organization. Sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
Okay, so he is actually opening out the notion of the political. And for us, growing up in that era, of course, I was, formed at the Subaltern Studies Center, but I'm not, I'm very aware of their problems. But I think you are kind of misreading in part. Okay. And please don't go in for Ben Zakaria's very provocative. There was no chest thumping, no cheering, nothing. If you look at the reaction of Subaltern Studies within mainstream historiography, it's tremendous rage. And these figures always remained marginal to Indian academia. And sometimes they say it, that except for Shahid Amin, let's say, and Gyan Pandey, who worked at Delhi University for several years, except for them, they say, we have managed to carry on with this radical potential precisely because we have remained marginal. So I think you need to look at that history of early subaltern studies a little more carefully. And the dismissal also is, it had very serious historians, right? So you can't just take on Dipesh Chakraborty to say that there's a lack of attention to empirical data.
Can I?
Yeah.
Just a little little fun thing. So, about the margins, Ishita and I met at the third Subaltern Studies conference, and a very major historian, Barun Day, actually told her father, they're both very intelligent kids. Why are they working on such marginal subjects?
And
we were along,
He even said with Gautam, why
Yes.
with Gutam?
Because
You know,
vernacular,
but, yeah.
sources, etc. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, anyway, that's not important here. But the point is, I think if you're looking at Guha, you have to look at this, the early reception of subaltern studies within India. And the reaction was criticism from both counts. I also met Nurul Hasan personally, and he said the same thing. Why go to the center and, why subaltern studies, right? Because they were also challenging Marxist historiography of a certain strain, being Marxists themselves. Okay. Now, so this opening up of the consciousness, second more important point is that Ranjit Guha's structuralism, I think, owes much more to the linguistic tradition than to the sociological tradition.
Yeah.
It is clearly Saussure. It is very clearly Saussure, and also Panini, mind you. Yeah. So I think that also is, so you cannot just. I don't think he even refers to Durkheim even once. And his
No, but
elementary aspect
Durkheim is present.
is
It's
present,
elementary aspect.
but I think it's much more the linguistic structuralism than, Okay, so that's, so if you think of his opening up the notion of the political by saying that these peasants, tribal or non-tribal, are part of our modernity, can you really make that kind of argument about the primitive rebel or the residual nationalist? I don't think he's a residual nationalist. Think very carefully about this. I think you have to think very carefully about this. And
if I could just add, residual nationalism, there are two things. One, so you spoke about the bourgeoisie not speaking for the nation, but it was also, and that question remains, Guha also speaks, in that preface, he speaks of the failure. The task of subaltern studies is to address the question of the failure of the Indian nation into its own.
Yes.
Which has betrayed its its poor subaltern, its dispossessed citizen. And, this is about, in some senses, reclaiming a nation, which is about the terms of radical politics today. And there is another issue there, which is, residual nationalism doesn't work because if you think nationalism, we're all very subversive and radical here, most of us. So we think you don't like the nation, and we think because we don't like the nation, it can, we toss it out of the window. Right? But if you look at actual history writing, traditions of radical history writing, from British histories from below, the Communist Party group of historians, to formations of radical history writing on South Africa, to Alltagsgeschichte, which is history of everyday life, to Microhistoria, to history of African American literature. This is all history writing which is critical, radical, but it's formed under the impress and mark of the nation. And that has to do with the fact that history as a discipline grew, vinculado, completely connected with the nation, since that's the history of the discipline. So when people come out to democratize history writing, and these are all people who we owe so much to, they can, they can never just shrug off the nation. There has to be, there's a struggling against the nation, and yet there's a containment. And I think subaltern studies works along the similar lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more point about negation, but not just negation. I think you can also pay greater attention to Ranjit Guha's brilliant discussion of how the codes of conduct change during an insurgency, where the rebel is actually using the lowest form of address, meaning we have something low, even lower than the tu in Bengali. So he shows brilliantly how during such acts of resistance they are dropping from the aap, which is usted, to the lowest form in addressing the superior, which is not the colonial state. So there is a very clear consciousness that your immediate oppressors are not the colonial masters, but the intermediaries. So I think And the final point is sort of already referred to Shades of Wildness of Ajay Skari. I'm sure you've read it, but he shows the gradation, the hierarchy, even in this wildness, in marking out wildness. But the final point was, since we are talking about settled agriculture, but tribal and peasant, who are not necessarily tribals as the subaltern, maybe you could engage a little bit with the debate on, and in anthropology, on the tribe caste continuum. That is, I think, is very, very important for. Thank you.
Folks, guys, come on. We have to turn him from the red corner to the blue corner.
Yeah.
The lucha libre.
So I'm going to come, as I usually do in this seminar, in other such contexts, I'm going to come at it a bit from the outside. It's quite evident for anyone working here in Mexico that both history is a very nationalist discipline here, and certainly anthropology. And that it has its own sort of provincial obsessions, and I don't mean it in a negative sense. I just mean it in more of a sort of analytical, descriptive sense. I think one can say as much, at least as much, about subcontinental history and anthropology. And so it's this, and so for me, there's often a bit of a reiterative feeling of, especially in contexts such as these, of encountering an argument along the of a similar form, along the lines of that author that says they're all subversive is reproducing colonial discourse. And it's sort of again and again that form of argument that I'm hearing. And I'm sure that it's that it has its value within those discourses, but it to me it also without sort of how should I say, implying that that making that argument, and in particular here, and again, I'm coming from outside, so I'm not even that familiar with the literature that you're referring to, but I read the paper carefully. You know, what about this the sort of the bigger picture? Because for me, a lot of the precisely coming from it from a very different perspective and sort of having different sort of associations. A lot of what comes, a lot of what authors sort of attack as colonial discourse and colonial ideology, although to be sure it presents its own unique outlines that have to do both with colonial realities and with the particularities of colonial situations, which of course is very different in different places, but always seems to have so much to do with the discourses of modernity at large, at a much larger scale. And so, for example, much of the sort of compulsion behind what you call primitivism sits well with an entire body of public panics, anxieties, and fears in Europe about the crowd, with the rise of the urban, and precisely those fears in the sort of the core of empire are linked with the most modern forms available for reflection there, and not with primitive forms, right? So the irrationality, the sort of destructive or potentially destructive force of affect, etc., etc. A whole range of sort of genres of talking about these very fear-provoking, very contemporary, very modern forms. And so I would like to hear whether you see those parallels and to what extent it makes sense to, you know, especially nowadays, because really I'm not a specialist on the 19th century, but especially nowadays, to what extent does it make sense to also sort of integrate those discussions and not stay within an entirely sort of a post-colonial framework, but sort of incorporate post-colonialism within a sort of certain forms of discourse of modernity that has to do with modern concepts of temporality, of global temporality, that have to do with arguments that have been made by Las Casas, or just to cite one example, about the nature of human difference and the primitive. and a whole range of forms of otherings that arrive there with modernity, and so that, for example, if we think about it in terms of a sort of a waiting for the barbarians narrative, right? Because that is where the tribe starts striking the empire, right at the seam that keeps shifting. Then the waiting for the barbarians narrative is one that I've always read as metaphorical of a logic of modernity that goes beyond, let's say, British Empire in Africa.
Right.
And so sort of the barbarians at the door. So in that sense, I mean, I'm sort of disappointed to hear that the historians too need a savage, because I thought at least I could go to history as because I know we do, and it's no escape. But so maybe it's sort of a wider problem. A wider problem. So that's sort of my invitation also, and it might not be relevant for that paper that you're editing right now, but also sort of as a to solicit your opinion or your reflection on that.
Right.
But isn't it a question also of how the savage is done and undone in both anthropology and history? We've always had the savage being done again and again in anthropology. But anthropologists also undid the savage. And I think it's about tracing tracing those fractured registers. And this is related to the fact as well. I remember my parents, who are anthropologists, reading Ranajit Guha, and they were both, you call him just an evolutionary anthropologist of reproducing the presumptions. But, my father's very struck because Guha uses various ethnographies written in the 1940s, 50s, 30s. He uses them as historical evidence. Okay? And I remember my father saying that, when I wrote this stuff, observing forms of how the Kamar sit, before the superior, he said, I hadn't really realized that. So, and that's about that there is something critical and subversive at work in Ranajit Guha as well. So I'm not saying don't criticize. I think what we are saying is, but, what are the terms of critique? And what is the responsibility? But as I had written to you on Facebook, are we responsible for only that, we're responsible not just for what we create, we're responsible also for that which we destroy, which is, by the way, Anne Perry, who wrote Highgate Rise, a Victorian mystery novel. Right, so this doesn't come from Derrida. It comes from a murder mystery writer. Okay.
Perdón, sorry.
And everyone, we've got time. So.
Yeah.
No, actually, Flora just answered my question. I was a little bit lost because I read your paper in 2 days.
Yeah.
And then when I was nearly at the 50th page, then I began questioning why Uday is talking about the primitive and suddenly he's talking about the peasants. Because you start talking about the primitive like the one, I mean, I think it's the fault of my misreading and the fact that I read your paper on 2 separate days. But then I went to the first pages of your article and I reread it, and I said, oh, well, he's talking about the Santa Hul, that's why. But then I began questioning because, like 2 years, no, maybe a little less than 2 years, we read in Ishita's class in history, Ranajit Guha,
Elementary school.
yeah, and that, I mean, it's not a criticism, it's a question. Why, if Ranajit Guha, I think, I mean, I don't remember very well and I don't have my notes, but I just glanced at it, and if Ranajit Guha is not talking like, it's not using the concept primitive, and that's something I really didn't quite get. I'm not making myself clear.
Yeah.
So I think, what we might have after this onslaught is, and particularly as you think of your question,
Yeah.
let's have Uday respond to this stuff,
Okay.
and let's come back with more questions.
Okay. So I'll start with the last one because that's a clarificatory point. So so Ranajit Guha is obviously not using the primitive constantly, but I think, when you're talking about the elementary aspects, right? The question that strikes me, and I'm not sure whether anyone has, there might be other answers to the question, is that the question that strikes me is why should the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency or any peasant politics, not even insurgency, resistance, why should they be found among the Santals and the Mundas? Why should they? Why not among, other kinds of communities who are, say, designated lower down some kind of caste hierarchy?
But they are.
They are.
The Kamar. He finds
No,
them in the
but
Kamar
in-
who are very, very
But
low.
in the he has, as you were saying, there are hundreds literally, and he kind of has like laundry lists of these, indigo. But if what is interesting is that, and he has himself worked on, say, the indigo protests in Bengal around the same time actually as the Hool, pretty much more or less the same within a decade. But what is interesting is the analysis of peasant subjectivities in the two different cases, right? And that is what really motivated me to start thinking about this. What is the difference? So there are peasants and there are peasants, And in any case, even those who work within a very Marxist sociological framework who went in looking at Green Revolution and peasants, they knew very well there's all this stuff about kulaks and whatnot and, all sorts of different ways of stratifying the peasantry. And I'm sure, certainly Ranjit Guha must have been aware of these but that is, the question for me was why this set of group, this particular, subset of the peasantry being seen as particularly exemplifying certain sociopolitical logics that, illustrate what is in fact a wider 19th century logic of anti-colonial rebellion. So what is so is there a particular way that we can explain this? Now, one way, what you're saying, I completely agree that he, if you think about the 70s, many, people like Andre Bete, who went and wanted to do field work in a tribal area, in fact, the same area where I worked, and he said, well, these are all peasants. They're cultivators.
But that sounds...
So, what? but what seems to me is that there is a way in which the tribe and the peasant, which in an earlier generation was seen as polarities, were being seen as part of a continuum, which is, its own kind of sliding scale logic. But on the other hand, there are many people who said, well, maybe the tribal cultivator is a special kind of peasant. There were these kinds of debates going on in sociological circles, often whether Marxist or non-Marxist otherwise. And certainly historians were keeping some track of what was happening. And it seems to me not so surprising that coming in the early 80s, that, the tribe would be subsumed within the category of peasant. But you see, at no point, and this is one of the early critiques of in fact, there's a very interesting review by Chris Bailey in the Journal of Peasant Studies, which says two things. One of which is about the absence of the state in the analysis of peasant communities, which he thought was somewhat odd because people like, Eric Stokes had also talked about peasant communities with the state being kind of pretty central. So he wondered what was the reason why the state was kind of morphed out. In some ways. The other thing he said was that we don't know anything about peasant stratification within peasant society. What peasants are we talking about? If this is a Marxian vocabulary that we're supposed to use, are we talking about kulaks? Are we talking about middle peasants who are supposedly benefiting from Green Revolution and whatnot? Are we talking about people who are left behind and who are from these kind of modernizing kind of agrarian agendas? Which peasant is not a question that you will be able to find an answer to in the early or any subaltern.
But that was not Guha's question.
No, but I'm saying from the point of, so when you So what I'm trying to do is not to inhabit, the terms in which the object was constructed. Rather, because I think if one is to see a kind of, it's like a colonial history of colonialism. If one were to do that, it wouldn't be interesting, to my mind. If I were to, understand colonial history in merely the colonizers' terms, for example, it wouldn't be very interesting. So in some way, it's interesting for me to juxtapose what, I know that Ranajit Guha and others have talked about from their own vantage points and certainly their views have evolved, as I wrote, Partha Chatterjee saying that the state was not something that they really thought about, and he would write things differently in the present moment, especially with his work on political society and so on. So I think it's very important. I readily accept that. But I also think one has to look at the same historical moment or historiographical moment from other vantage points, one of which, say, is peasant studies, which is not merely a South Asian matter. And certainly I don't see that as particularly at odds with the enterprise that, any of these people. The other thing I would say, and this is also very important and actually something I don't emphasize here, is that it's very important, I think, to disentangle subaltern studies from post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies at large. Because look at this book that has now come out that with Vivek Chibber. And now, he seems to think that there are these three individuals, the gang of three, who are somehow exemplary in their mischief and who embody post-colonial studies at large in the world, and especially in the US. And this is exactly the kind of thing I want to avoid, because when I talk about the entanglement of power and resistance, that is the Prakash and Haynes point, or the point about hybridity that you find in Bhabha, or even the kind of unease with speaking for the subaltern that Spivak talks about, I really want to bring out the disjunctures. A lot of people have made the argument that, this early subaltern studies was this wonderful kind of history from below, and then it was subverted by the likes of Spivak and Bhabha. This is exactly the opposite of what I want to say. Because, in fact, I think that there were real failings, which I think most people now acknowledge, and post-colonial studies is certainly not the kind of straw man that we can use to kind of... In fact, if anything, much of the antidote to this kind of early moment of history writing is to be found on the literary side of things and not in subaltern studies and its historical interlocutors. So that is one thing which is not emphasized here. And so, so late subaltern studies and post-colonial literary studies at large actually are very positively cited in this particular, the argument that I'm making. And so therefore, again, this question of looking at the same moment in scholarly history, or, in the history of primitivism, if you were to call it, from different vantage points, from the point of view of peasant studies, from the point of view of late subaltern studies, from the point of view of the literary side of post-colonial studies. And I think, and in other words, it's not actually the kind of fratricide, in other words, or patricide. So, in that...
Ranjit is 3 times his age, right? 3 times.
Yeah. No, but I mean, even those who do follow there are people who still work with, and none of us, anyone in this room, but there are still people who, work within a simple kind of thinking that somehow there is this narrative that colonialism, modernization, etc., tells about itself. The state tells. And somehow, if we are able to come up with an inversive reading, if we were just to reverse the terms of that, we would, instead of the state, we valorize community or peasant. There's work in, my own advisor, Jim Scott, is sometimes a moral economy, is sometimes opposed to the state, and the modern state and its logic.
He's a greater neo-romantic than Ranjit Guha.
Yeah. So, but, this is not, what I'm trying to say is that this is not peculiar to South Asia, it's not peculiar to history writing. It's a wider phenomenon where people, who want to be in solidarity with the marginal, with the subaltern, with the peasant, the indigenous, are very keen to invert the language of the state, and this is where I say that we must be very cautious about saying this is the radical move to be made.
Sure.
So, and this is not, and so it's not a case of, patricide. In some ways, what I'm trying to also say is that let's look at that particular intervention that was made in elementary aspects from these different vantage points. Try to, and this is an impulse, this whole impulse of trying to invert. This is something we do all the time. Even when you post something on Facebook that seems to be endorsing some cause, somehow we've taken on the cause as our own. Because we are, this is an impulse. We are having fair trade coffee, or this is something that's everywhere. It's not merely about history writing, and this is, and we feel very virtuous when we do this.
No, absolutely.
And this is, so for me, there is, and what Spivak has to say is actually very important there about, representing subalternity and subaltern voices. So, I mean, in that, so I kind of see myself very much. On the one hand, very much, I could see myself within that particular landscape that has now come into existence after that early moment in subaltern studies. But at the same time, I think that, and actually that is what Partha Chatterjee's essay was about, that, he says a new project, a new time calls for a new kind of reading of the past, and it was a product of its own times, with its own aims and ambitions, as well as its own blind spots and anxieties. So it is not to say that what came before was so awful that we must abandon it, but it is to understand a particular strand of it, and where I think we could, in fact, move forward with a critical dialogue. So that is the kind of wider stakes, in the answering different questions here about what are the stakes and about
it's
critique.
a dialogue.
Yeah, and the terms of dialogue, it's very important for me not to be doing the Chibber kind of critique. This is very important.
You're doing a bit of it.
Don't quote Ben Zakaria.
Okay.
No, but he can quote him, but with a
because
certain
Ben is all about,
Yeah, I understand.
disaffect.
Yeah,
He's a
yeah.
very,
Yeah.
he's got these Rasta hair, and he plays the guitar really well. And, he's a mean fast bowler in cricket. He's very gifted,
Yeah.
but he also thinks he's God's gift to humanity and particularly womankind.
not what
Yeah.
you cite about the chest thumping, and there was nothing. That's why I mentioned the reception.
Yeah.
Of subaltern studies,
but-
yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
So are they?
No,
Yeah.
carry on.
Sorry,
Still
But the couple of things I wanted to say, one was about whether, okay, you actually asked something very interesting about whether the savage slot can be banished at all, or whether some residual nationalism or some nationalism can be banished at all from our, from some kind of critical intervention we are trying to make. And I think the question is, first of all, I don't think, whatever any of us say is going to banish the tribe or any such. That's the kind of basic point that I want to make clear. I certainly don't have the very modest ambitions in that sense. But, and especially because, the idea of tribe has obviously taken on a life of its own everywhere, not just in Asia or Africa, but everywhere in the world. And yes, it is very much a part of, it's not just about the colonial or the post-colonial, it's also, it has to do with a certain kind of moral panic, which is integral to modernity at large.
And to the globe.
Yes, and to the global. And, you see this with, the way in which the concept of indigenous has spread like wildfire. And the way in which the contestations around the term indigenous, of course, you guys know very well from this part of the world, but certainly other places where it has been bequeathed to as a gift. But so anyway, so there is. So I certainly see, and in talking about the question of neo-romanticism or the way in which Tacitus and so on. I mean, so thinking about the kind of interconnected histories of the term itself, because tribe as a term lends itself to this kind of analysis, and it's not peculiar to Indian sociology in any case. I mean, in Southeast Asia, the work that has been done in kind of understanding certain zones which are just seen as wild, or people who are seen as wild, I think is quite interesting. And I think South Asianists actually have been quite far behind in learning from Africanists and Southeast Asianists in this regard. So that is something that I feel that there is a lot more that can be done collaboratively, thinking beyond national frames and yes, indeed, thinking about not just colonialism and its forms of knowledge, but modernity and its forms of knowledge, which are interconnected. And that also, of course, helps us interrogate whatever social sciences that we are invested in. Okay. I was wondering if I should.
And you can carry the questions with you.
Yes, that's
stop
very.
at 6, so
yeah.
if you have
questions,
You
yeah.
can also
No,
go
but
a
you
little
can,
longer
yeah.
if you want.
Yeah.
And you can leave when you
And
want.
while you think a very quick thing, we have a core group, as Saurav mentioned,
Yeah.
and the papers are circulated to the core group and not obviously on the Cuenta de Avisos. So if anyone wants to join the core group, all you need to do is, write to any of us and with your email, and we'll just add you
Well,
to
the
the list.
email will be there, Ishita,
That's all, yeah.
if they
Yeah.
write to us.
Yes, I mean, whatever, but they have, yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
so one thing I was going to say about Ranajit Guha and I think you're absolutely right about CPM politics, about the reception of very critical reception of subaltern studies in India and the UK in particular. And then the way in which the vernacular was being disparaged to people working on communities deemed marginal to the national project. Also the question about differences differences and emphases between Dipesh Chakrabarti and later interpreters of that earlier moment. And again, that is also one reason why we should not be working with those historical materials from the kind of telling the stories that the practitioners themselves tell of that particular project. I think there need to be more narratives of that. But I think one thing I'd say here is that I certainly don't, if it comes across this way, I certainly don't intend it to be a kind of frontal assault on subaltern studies or even Ranajit Guha, because I think there is the reason why I chose this particular work, and certainly not his earlier work on rule of property for Bengal, which deals with the way in which the idea of a certain kind of landed property comes into being in eastern India in the Bengal presidency, and the kind of and the kind of intellectual and social history around that, I think that is a very fine work. And certainly even in the same period, if you look at some of the essays that he has on the indigo protests in Bengal, in the Bengal-Bihar borderlands, I think you see a sensitivity to subaltern subjectivities, because there is this sense, not only in terms of empirical detail, but there is also this sense that it's quite complicated in understanding subaltern life worlds. It's not simply a matter of negation. So, and one of the tendencies, of course, later subaltern studies in various, people who are not even within the fold, have also tried to illustrate the complexities and the ambivalences and the ambiguities of subaltern politics. That otherwise, it's very easy for us to assume that just because the people are actually oppressed and dominated, that they are immediately and instantly roused to rebellion and violent rebellion. And I think that's an issue, because I think we have to think about a whole range of a continuum of subaltern politics, which is not about outright defiance and rebellion at all.
Sure.
And that is, of course, something that most people today would acknowledge. And I think this is really important because, there is this sense that we shouldn't be doing our radical politics vicariously. This is a big concern for me.
But just a second, but it's not about rebellion, but is it still about resistance, or are you willing to let go of that too?
So for the way I think about it, so instead of negation, of power, modern state, colonialism, whatever, if we can think about negotiation, about strategies of negotiation, which may include, killing the constable and so on. But when you negotiate, your relationship with the object of negotiation is an intimate one. You actually understand the rules and regulations. You are able, and this is exactly the kind of analysis that Ranajit Guha does in the when he's talking about the Indigo Revolt. They understand the Indigo regime, the way the European planters work. So there is this, and in terms of the consciousness of the insurgent, there is this, so the historian kind of lays this out in a way that he would not want it laid out in the elementary aspects for some reason. Yeah.
More questions before I? Yeah, Lucia. I'll just wait for
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I feel like a little bit like strange in how I'm thinking about what you were all saying.
Sure.
Because I feel like at the same time I feel like I'm familiar with this discussion and not so much.
Right.
You know, because being an anthropologist, I've been close to this discussion about the Sabbath, the indigenous experience.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm not as familiar as I wish I was with subaltern studies, etc. Because I've only just started studying these things a few years ago. And before that, I wasn't reading anything. So I get a little bit lost with the discussion and the arguments of very specific authors. But there are some points that I find really interesting because when I was doing my master's dissertation, I had this problem that what I wanted to say was that in this specific context that I was working, which was Turkey in the 20th century, you had many different discourses of modernity that were in a constant argument, and that it was not a very, it could not be traced in a dialectical model. Like one discourse against another, like one discourse, a hegemonic discourse against like a subaltern discourse or something. But you had many parallel different discourses of modernity, some of which were not necessarily being traced as such as discourses of modernity. So my question was, one of my problems was when I was writing this thesis is how do you go beyond that dialectic model without falling into a polite conversation? And how you do that without missing like the fierce energy of critique? Because that energy is like vital to make new thinking like grow.
Yes. Yeah, this is exactly what Saurabh was trying to say, because I think there has to be some balance between, the kind of model of critique that we've inherited in the academic disciplines, which is about frontal, breakdown of the arguments, and then you kind of, there's a polemical aspect of it, but there's also this very cold, rational kind of breakdown, and then you kind of tear it apart, and then offer some other whatever model of how to do this. But I think that has to be, for me, simple thing I'd say is that when if we were to think of Ranajit Guha, let's not historicize necessarily as we've been doing so far, but if we were to think of Ranajit Guha as our contemporary, think of Ranajit Guha as a metaphor, because in some ways there's a bit of Ranajit Guha's arguments in all of what we do, right? If we were to think about it in a more theoretical way, and there is that particular passion and energy in kind of reversing the oppressor's terms of reference and so on. And certainly colonialism and so on, get our goats. But at the same time, there is this sense that I was saying that if we inhabit that particular habitus, then this is as much about us, right, as it is about something that happened in 1981, which seems like, it's an historical event that we are trying to unravel. So I would like it to be really about the impulse to write radical histories of the margins, which is as much about issue today as it was 30 or 35 years ago. And there the question becomes, if this is about us, this is also about our ambivalence to the subject matter and the sources we are looking at, and our anxieties and how we deal with them, right? So it is not about, shooting at Ranajit Guha, 35 years after the event. That is the meaningless exercise,
But that's how you come across.
Right. So that is one of the things that I think, which is, the way in which I would like to rewrite is to think about this as a contemporary problem. It's not merely an excavation of something that happened long time ago, and that there are some lessons of history or something that we ought to learn. But it is really about saying this whole, and as even the same thing about primitivism. It's very much alive and kicking. About when you think of the indigenous movements and so on. So I really,
it's coetzee and waiting for the barbarians. It's the it's the
Yeah.
endless circulation of African art and
Yeah,
Australian.
yeah.
Collections are made out
Yeah,
of it. It
yeah.
lies at the heart of
Yeah.
of Capitol and the Guggenheim Museum.
Yeah.
And MoMA too.
So can we think about some of the energy, that the radical energy of critique, the kind of which is often a violent energy, can we also turn some of it inwards?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to come back on something he said, but
Yeah.
you go ahead.
No, I have
Okay.
It's a bit of a rounding up.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
So very quickly, I think why I mentioned the linguistic influence, structuralism is
Yes.
the great attention he pays to language
Yeah.
in the colonial reports.
Yeah.
So I think there is a very clear recognition of the sensibility of the subaltern. Because the project is precisely to establish that the subaltern, very vague, but defined by domination, is a conscious political agent.
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
Yeah.
By criticizing, he says in reports, they all are contagious, spread like epidemics,
Yeah,
meaning
yeah.
that there is no logic. And he begins on that premise that no, there is a logic because these are conscious acts. And that is why negation, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
the condition,
yeah,
the
yeah,
very
yeah.
condition of being the
Subaltern,
subaltern,
yeah.
of being dominated is what makes him.
Right,
So
right.
I mean, the
Yeah.
insurgency is, he also says, insurgency is when you catch it at its best because that's the last resort.
Yeah.
It's only when accommodation, negotiation, everything fail that they rise up. So it's not as
Sure.
if it's, they are unaware that. As Bhattacharya says, that the insurgent peasant is, let's say, subaltern consciousness at its best. But these are just moments. This is not
Right.
everyday life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, if I could just sort of add to that, and you can ask questions, but if there are no, we could sort of think of this as a kind of a wrapping up.
Yeah.
So it seems to me, you use these phrase that, it's not as if in Chipper finds three people as exemplary in their mischief. Guha comes across as the exemplar of
Yeah.
mischief in your writing.
Yeah.
Okay. You speak about how, why didn't he look at people who were even lower, because Ranjit Guha was looking, in discussing the Santals and Mundas and so on, I think because they rebelled, and he was seeking to look for rebel consciousness, and you can't find rebel consciousness, but where people don't rebel. No, so it's not a conscious exclusion. He's looking at the archive. And of course, there is, I think, Nitsan's question pointed towards that when he said, is resistance adequate? Because in some senses, it's not just about that continuum of passivity to resistance, but it is about, how are we to face not just resistance or negotiation, but how are we to think of what is implied by the idea of negotiation or resistance, that basically social orders are stable, right? And then you have a rebellion. What about if you think that social orders are themselves, in not just in flux, but they are constantly being undone, not just being rebuilt, that they're fraying at the seams, if you will. So, I think the crux, basically, it seems to me, is that you are you, and having known you and read you, are as split as Ranjit Guha.
Yeah.
Okay? No, but this is a constitutive splitness, if you will, because, this is something which you need to look into, because you sort of discuss subaltern studies and, as, or Ranjit Guha without looking at the kinds of discussions which have taken place. And this is not to say I wrote on the stuff, but I was an impossible youth in 1983-84 who wrote Peasant Insurgency and Peasant Consciousness, which was published in Economic and Political Weekly. And this was a discussion of elementary aspects. And Ranjit Guha is deeply disappointed. Why was he deeply disappointed? Because he had seen me as a young boy in shorts. So, and so it wasn't why Saurabh wrote this thing. It was, Mukul's brother, that's my elder brother, who was his disciple in Sussex. He said, how could Mukul's brother write this thing? Surely it's the Sarkars who have put him up to mischief. Now, what I'm saying is that are we to bring in the everyday of the academe, which you don't have access to necessarily. I mean, he didn't see you in shorts. But I think what is at stake in some senses over there is other questions. How are we to read? What are the protocols of our reading? And the splitness which I was speaking about is, Ranjit's splitness, which I discuss in a chapter on subaltern studies in Stitches on Time, a book which he doesn't like, by the way. That discusses how the very conditions of possibility of Ranjit Guha's writing, his arguments, depend on upbraiding of separate tongues. He speaks not just in one voice. To use the biblical thing, he speaks in separate tongues, and it's about upbraiding. So Ranjit Guha does, can make the peasant subject entirely coeval with colonialism and with modernity. But at the same moment, like 5 pages later, he reifies, bourgeois, 16th century bourgeois revolution, 17th century bourgeois revolution in Britain as the greatest gift to humanity. He can be anti-Eurocentric and he can be totally Eurocentric. Now, to me, the interesting question is, how do we hang on to both these aspects rather than celebrate one or the other? Which is where I find your article coming in. But that's where the reworking needs to take place. Because your splitness is of somewhat different order. I'm sorry, I'm just going to get personal now, because we have to get personal about the everyday. You have a sensitive ethnographic and a poetic sensibility. And yet you write, in this hard-headed, muscular way, bringing in the polemical at points. Now, I'm not saying, that there is anything wrong with it, but it's a tension which is worth thinking through. Which one would you want to stay with more, right? So I think you should stay with the first, because that leads to poetic writing as well, which you're capable of. And the questions which come up there are, how are we to write? Ranjit Guha's book can be read as a history of a history of failure. How are we to write? Guha himself saw them as successful, these rebellions. Except at the end he says, they possessed everything to overturn. Let me read this. He says they possessed nearly everything to overturn the world. Right? That they were going to turn, except they couldn't do it. And this book, he says, one hopes may be of relevance for all efforts meant to bring about a more abiding and comprehensive reversal. Now that is the kind of, radicalism by proxy which he was speaking about, and which I disagree with as well. I mean, if you want to do politics, go out and bloody do it. Don't, enact it in this world of privilege and entitlement and so on, which is the academe. So I think the questions there are, how are we, about writing histories of failure. How are we to write these histories of failure? Because his is a history of a failure. It is itself a history which is a failed history because of these unbearable tensions. It excited us, right? But it bears these tensions which don't stand up after all this time unless we turn him into that interlocutor in our present. We recognize him as a friend. We recognize him as someone who is one of us and who is as faulty as we are. Right? Which gets to the next point, how are we to then enter the protocols of his reading? While being critical, but at the same time, recognizing that there were certain logics, including contradictory ones, at work there. So it seems to me concretely, it seems to me that you could write this article for the American Historical Review, where you'd have to stick with what you're doing, or you could bring in these questions, including questions about the histories of the disciplines, right? You could bring in the fact that Elementary Aspects was not just written in the early 80s with some familiarity of of sociological theories. Ranjit Guha was deeply dismissive of Andre Bete. He learned nothing from him, okay, even in dismissal. This book was actually written in the 1960s and 1970s. It was written in a situation of utter loneliness, where Ranjit Guha had an enormous working load teaching at the University of Sussex. He would go off, to the India Office Library, Blackfriars Road, and that was his sustenance with that impossible. So this is, we think of Guha as this prophet and the Pope and so on and so forth, with his cardinals around, but, he was not successful once, right? So can we admit that? What about the history of disciplines? What about, and what is the crucial questions there for me, in terms of your own narrative, which is a very enabling one, particularly linked to the first part of your paper, which I think you need to do more with. But if you're going to address Guha with that narrative which comes up in the third part, it's about the two crucial questions to me are what are the relationships between state and community? Because the larger problem is not Ranjit Guha. It's subaltern studies, early and later one, setting up an absolute opposition between state and community.
Right.
Even when Shahid Amin undoes it, in event metaphor memory, he can't actually carry the logic through because, state and community are opposed to each other. When Partha tries to go back beyond it, he comes up with, he comes up with this notion of political community, which is, governmentality of Foucauldian governmentality by another name. Earlier the community was something which would bring about revolution. Now, pardon my words, the community is fucked. Mainly, so you stay with.
Yes and no.
Now the community is an ideological concept in a machine of building liberal governance. If you want to.
Okay, that's better. But I'm getting. So where are we? And the other question is, of course, the relationship between power and difference, because resistance is founded on a notion of order, and it's founded on a notion of a certain relationship. It's not just about state and community. It's always also about power being outside, and difference, subalternity, being on this side of it. And who are we with? Never with power. We're always with difference. So the questioning, the vicarious aspects of radical politics is, to laugh hard at oneself and show our own complicities, not as a form of self-flagellation. I'm so bad, I'm going to have another glass of wine. But, it's much more about recognizing these aspects. So staying with these things, I think, why don't you think of another article based on this, which goes much more to representations or to third text, rather than the American Historical Review.
And I'll add half a sentence taken from a very niece of mine who's a very bright young historian who says, why not read the texts themselves as open-ended and not look at, the author's logic, intention, purpose as completely given from the beginning. Look at it something that, where there are contradictions, where they're struggling and juggling. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, but he doesn't need to submit now. He's not in the North American
For the text he reads, authors have submission deadlines. They have to send it.
No.
Way to tie up everything.
Bueno, I just wanted to thank all of you, Saurabh, because as Nitsan commented, this has been one of the best attended sessions of Kultura y Poder.